You're listening to Learning is the New Working, a podcast by the Learning Futures Group about the future of workplace learning and the people helping define it. This episode is another of our collaborations with RedThread Research in a season that we call Is Purpose Working? We're very grateful for the team at NovoEd for their sponsorship of this season. Global enterprises rely on NovoEd's collaborative online learning platform to build high-value capabilities that result in real impact. With NovoEd, you deliver powerful, engaging learning that activates deep skill development and drives measurable business outcomes. NovoEd will host a live webinar later in the season where Danny, Stacia and I will reflect on what we've learned, the implications for you as learning and talent teams, and take your questions and comments live. To reserve your seat, to get your questions in, and find other bonus materials, please register now at www.novoed.com/purpose.
Johnson & Johnson has long been a purpose-based organization, and the story of our founders and what they were trying to achieve and to accomplish was certainly much more about purpose and broad impact in the world than it ever was about profits.
That was Clint Kofford. He's the global head of the Performance Institute at Johnson & Johnson. Johnson & Johnson is the largest, most broadly based healthcare company in the world and one of only a handful of companies that's been successful for over a century of operations. Their story illustrates that being purpose-driven is by no means a new or recent phenomena. We're starting this episode with the debrief conversation by way of an executive summary for you. I sat down with Stacia and Danny to talk about the conversation we had with Clint, and I started by asking Stacia to give us some context regarding Johnson & Johnson and its significance to a conversation about purpose and talent.
J&J is in many ways one of the best known organizations when it comes to purpose. They have their Credo, which started in 1943, which was developed in 1943. And it was developed by Robert Wood Johnson II and really came from this place of kind of human dignity. He actually said when he first developed it that he thought that the whole matter of dignity in employment boils down to every worker from the chairman of the board to the office boy or sweeper is a human being, and that they are endowed with this ego, and that in some ways modern business had reduced the size of that ego, but that it was actually critical for an organization to enable that ego, that sense of, I am a person who matters. And so when he developed this Credo, he was thinking about that concept, starting first with the patients, the doctors, the nurses, the mothers and fathers, but then going through all the different stakeholders and really fundamentally coming back to this sense of dignity, and that their purpose as an organization was to connect back to that sense of dignity. I think it's also interesting, he even anticipates the idea that some people might say, well, this isn't what a business is about. And the Credo was actually developed before J&J went public. And so it was a very clear statement to potential shareholders that this is where we stand. These are our values. And then he actually put into the end of the Credo, he said, if we put our customers first and follow through on our other responsibilities, I assure you the stockholders will be well served. I think it's a beautiful way to kind of pull it all together and again, to recognize that dignity of people.
We think of this purpose as being a new concept because of all the recent news around the Business Roundtable. But in fact, organizations have operated, from this point of perspective for many years. And if anything, the 70s and Milton Friedman focus on shareholder primacy is kind of a blip. I find that very interesting and comforting, maybe.
Yeah, I think it is interesting and comforting. That said, I think that there has long been a focus on a efficiency mindset of capitalism. So if you go back to a book that we started this series talking about, Chris, The Enlightened Capitalists, James O'Toole makes the point that, these purpose-driven organizations have often been anomalies, whether you're talking about Robert Owen or the founders of Unilever. So that the idea isn't new, but the idea that it should be widespread or widely adopted is not necessarily firmly established, shall we say, even over, starting with the 1700s. But I do think that this ultra focus on the shareholder is a blip. Because I think that the general mindset in many instances, certainly not all, particularly when you look at the industrialists of the 1920s, but in many instances it is an over-focus, and I think maybe we're correcting back.
Yeah, and also this idea that they're in opposition, that you can, you can't have both together, and that's clearly being re-examined. A couple of things from our conversation with Clint that was really interesting to me. One was this Human Performance Institute that he runs, and how the physical, emotional, and mental energies come together. And he talked about spiritual energy. It was really quite amazing.
When he said spiritual, he immediately then said, which for me means purpose. Like, he immediately connected spiritual to purpose. And the point that he made, I think, there was that you can have these other capabilities, the mental, the physical, etc., but until you align them and have that clarity, that you don't achieve that next level of performance, what those most successful people were doing. And I thought was, in some ways, a beautiful way of explaining much of what we've been talking about, which is that enablement and that alignment to purpose is that thing that enables that higher level. We've been talking about organizational performance, and he was talking about individual, but really that higher level of performance.
He also said, this is another theme that I'm getting from all of these conversations, to keep coming back to this, is that the Credo comes in super handy when we have to make decisions. Purpose brings clarity.
I thought one of the interesting things that he's doing with that institute is he's not just focusing on the mental. So most organizations think of sort of purpose as a mental exercise, but he brought in this idea of paying attention to diet and paying attention to weight and equipping the people in the organization with tools to take care of those things as well. So they're not just worried about the mental aspect of their folks or the people that they serve. They're worried about the entire person.
Yeah, shipping out these advanced tools to people's homes under COVID in order to keep that focus on your physical well-being as well as your mental well-being.
I think this was one of the clearest examples we saw from somebody of a connection between individual purpose and what the organization was enabling. So that career planner that he mentioned, and then tying all of that back to the Credo. So we say in the Credo that we need to have a sense of security and purpose in our jobs. And so we're having these conversations with people about their purpose and then connecting that to their career aspirations. I just found that so remarkable and almost like the holy grail of what we've been looking for in these conversations of how do you take a concept and make it rigorous and something individuals can actually connect to.
Yeah, and a very clear role for L&D in this whole conversation and this argument, a real clear tactic. The one other thing I thought was interesting in the conversation was a little bit counter-trend to what I see, and that is they're taking this Performance Institute and they're focusing it inwards. Quite a lot of companies right now are taking their learning engines and using them to engage with external stakeholders, customers and partners. They're obviously very, very focused on turning this to get their own performance where it needs to be. I thought that was kind of interesting too.
What do you make of that, Chris?
I was surprised. I think he says in the conversation that they're going to offer it to some strategic partners. Mm-hmm. And like I say, it's a little bit counter-trend. So it'd be interesting to see how that plays out.
I think it's counter-trend, but I wonder if that's where we're going. I wonder if the pendulum is swinging back and they're just a little bit ahead of the curve.
Could be. He does also talk about access to talent and more less traditional ways to access talent. At one point in our conversation, which I thought was quite interesting that he's thinking about that too when he's thinking about the future.
Yeah, I've actually talked to a couple of people from J&J since then, and they mentioned the same thing. They're trying to figure out how to not just take care of the talent that has a W-2, but also the talent that they borrow from external sources.
Well, this is all about our next season, isn't it? And and skills and skill models, skill access models.
Can I add maybe a counterpoint? Because you both are saying that it's not on trend, but maybe a different interpretation is that it's very on trend in that, Danny, you and I have been talking about the integration of learning, performance, engagement, etc. And maybe because they combine their talent function with this Human Performance Institute. And as you said, it's that institute is looking at the whole person. maybe it's actually just a little bit more forward thinking in that holistic view of what's happening with employees and bringing it all together in a meaningful way that also includes, leadership and well-being. So maybe in that way, it's very, very on trend.
Yeah, I completely buy that. And I just think that generally this notion of having a learning function that is customer or partner focused and then turning it to point almost exclusively internal, that's what's a little bit different from other models that I'm seeing.
But it's kind of an interesting leverage question, isn't it? Because if you think about external, there's a limit potentially on the leverage that they're getting from those resources being externally focused, and that being the amount of revenue that they're bringing in through that team. And effectively, they're saying if we turn that inside, the revenue that we're going to be able to generate by making our own people more effective is much greater than we were with this as an externally facing unit that had to run its own P&L. So maybe it's just a really big bet on their own people.
Very, very, very good point. And I think also the trend towards engaging customers and partners is not necessarily driven as a revenue generating activity, which this was, right? So that might be something that's a little bit different.
Yeah, I bet you it's not at all. I think that's entirely a kind of a relationship thing and maybe an extension of purpose. When you think about back to their Credo, all these different groups, these strategic partners are very clearly a part of their community. When they talk about we're responsible to the communities in which we live and work, and to the world community as well.
Great conversation, a very interesting guy, and clearly purpose-driven organization, exemplary.
Yeah, I think we were lucky to get kind of we started this season talking about who we'd most like to talk to. And I think any of these kind of standard bearer organizations of purpose was at the top of our list, or should have been. And so I feel lucky that we were able to have the conversation.
So my name is Clint Kofford. I am the global head of the Human Performance Institute at Johnson & Johnson. And today is September 24th.
We always start with a question about what part of the world you live in, Clint, and why do you live and work there?
So I live in north central New Jersey, about 60 minutes from New York City, and I live here, predominantly because of my job. So I work for Johnson & Johnson, that's located in New Brunswick, New Jersey, is where our headquarters are.
But how would you describe the kind of work that you do?
Yeah, so I have the responsibility and privilege, really, of leading all of our enterprise development efforts. And so what that primarily focuses on is manager and leadership development at all of our levels. So everything from our individual contributors that would come in and need learning to grow and develop in their careers, all the way up to our most senior executives. And again, would be focused in areas like growth programs or capabilities and skills that would help people grow, manager capability, leadership development, but also enterprise skills like digital and data science. We're leaning in, and we don't own those exclusively, but partner with a number of our kind of stakeholders across the enterprise to bring to life these capabilities for Johnson & Johnson.
Now, there can't be many people on the planet who are not familiar with the brand Johnson & Johnson, but can you just kind of, in case someone's been under a rock, could you describe the business model and then how the Human Performance Institute sort of fits into that?
Johnson & Johnson is the largest and most diversified healthcare company in the world. And we have three big sectors that we operate in, and that's the pharmaceutical sector, the medical device sector, and consumer healthcare sector.
And the Institute's role in all that?
Yeah, so the Human Performance Institute was originally founded just over 30 years ago by two individuals, Jack Groppel and Jim Lair. And at the time, they were at the forefront of their fields in sports physiology and sports psychology, and they were studying tennis athletes. And what they realized was what separated the number one tennis athletes from the rest was, a combination of practices that help them really hone their, how they use their physical, mental, and emotional energy to bring about their spiritual energy, which is their purpose. So these kind of guiding principles of energy management, of resilience, of character,